But Brie and Camembert, you know, it's a particular subject where a lot of the traditional boundaries have become blurred. So this tasting tonight, we do every so often, about twice a year, we do a real special tasting. Most of them are quite detailed enough. If you've been on them before, you'll know that the traditional British or the modern British is detailed enough. But on this tasting, we're looking at one type of cheese, really. A type of cheese which is made fairly similarly, but has distinct characteristics, each region. Now, actually, the word brie and the word camembert aren't protected. So over the last 50, 60 years, we've seen a lot of blurring of boundaries. And I've seen bries that technically I think are camemberts in method of manufacture, and I've seen camemberts that, are a bit more like a brie. But what I'm going to look at tonight is the historic old-fashioned differences and what those cheeses should represent in their true form, really. So we're going to taste through, a range of bries and camemberts. I'm also not going to talk too much about what we call in the industry a modern brie or the kind of elastic brie. So the most bries you buy in the supermarkets will be what we call a stabilized brie type. And it's a different method of manufacturing your brie, which gives you kind of that springy, kind of supple texture and a kind of real kind of bounce to it. And that is to make the soft cheeses that are generally made for bries in supermarkets, not exclusively, are made for long shelf life, to coat well with being wrapped, and to be ripe for a long period. So when you buy them, you could buy them at week 10 and they'll be ripe. Buy them at week 30 and they'll be ripe. They wouldn't go over ammoniated, they wouldn't be chalky, they'd be perfectly ripe. As a result, you often end up with this kind of almost semi-elastic texture, and you end up with these perfectly white rinds. It's actually what they've done over the years is tweak the recipe and tweak the way that soft cheeses are made to make us what we call stabilized brie, a long, stable shelf life. And it's actually not a true example of a historic brie recipe. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. What we're looking at tonight is the classics and the originals and those differences. But they are made different to what you'd consider a kind of a factory industrial brie type in its method of manufacture. And that's why these are a little bit more tricky in that have longer periods underripe. They have a longer periods overripe and ammoniated at the end. They don't coat well to being wrapped because the rind will die off, they'll collapse. So this style of cheese is not liked by mass production and mass movements of cheese because it doesn't coat well with, it's not a stable, long life, perfect, easy to sell product. And that's why it's uncommonly found in its true form. But I'm sure you're just desperate to eat a bit of cheese. So I'll start nibbling on a bit of Chaource. Well, I pull up a little map and then we can have a little, you don't have to just look at me. This is a French map. We show this a little bit more in the French cheese tasting. But the reason I've pulled it up today is we are looking at the white rinded cheeses historically from northern France. And if you look, Brie, and I'm talking about Brie, Brie's the kind of the original and the classic. And Brie was a historic region of France, which is about here. Nowadays, that region has been split into three departments, if you're interested in your French. But there's the Île-de-France, which is mainly Paris. There's the Seine-et-Marne, which is there, and there's Champagne. Okay, but historically, Brie was an administrative region, which was here. So when we eat Brie, the Brie, like a lot of cheeses, like cheddar, Beaufort, they're named after the place, and Brie is this region here. Now, you look at this and you look at the white rinded cheeses of France, whether it be Neufchâtel, Brie de Moulin, Brie de Meaux, Chaource, Camembert de Normandie, they're all pointing to this northern region. And the reason being is that historically, cheeses kind of developed really climatic and geographic conditions. Around Paris, we tended to develop a lot of soft cheeses. The reason being is that soft cheese is really great to make in that you make it fast, it matures fast, you can sell it fast, and you get a good yield from your milk because it's soft. So it's a really economically, it's a real great cheese to make. You don't have to have as much space to mature it. You can get it to market faster, and you can sell it for a premium, and you get more bang for your buck. The fundamental problem with soft cheese is it doesn't travel and it doesn't keep. And not such a much problem in this day and age because we have refrigerated transport. But as little as, your grandparents probably grew up in an age when there wasn't refrigerated lorries. In fact, they probably had a larder in their home rather than a fridge. So brie just couldn't transport. The brie makers always say that the reason that people in London like their brie incredibly runny and over ammoniated is because it used to be by the time it had got to London, it was in that condition. So that's what they always say. So historically, you'd only make a soft cheese if you were close to a big market who you could sell it to. And that's what Paris is. And that's why the soft cheese is developed around Paris. So number one. Number two, they've got lots of chalky, sandy soils in this region. So the fresh sea air coming in across the English Channel, perfect conditions for white mold to grow. What white mold likes is a good airflow, lots of air, so it doesn't break down too fast, reasonable amount of air changes. And as a result, making white soft cheeses in this region, making soft cheese in this region, they would have traditionally gone white on the rind. Now, they are not as white historically as they were today. In this day and age, we think of brie as being a perfectly white cheese. Let me just pull this picture up for you. But as little as 300 years ago, the French, like everything, they'll tell you that champagne is traditionally, it's made traditionally. They keep alive these old-fashioned recipes. Like everything, times change. The olden days, the bottles weren't the same size and shape as they are today. The corks weren't the same size and shape as today. They didn't ferment champagne in stainless steel vats like they do today. So lots have changed. Even though they claim champagne is traditional, it's not. The same is true of brie. Brie traditionally would have looked like this. This is a painting from the 1700s of brie, of brie. And you'll see it's got a bit of white on there, but it's mainly red and brown. And there's a lot of blue on there as well. The white mold that you see on the outside of these cheeses has become more dominant as science has improved, and we've been able to inoculate it with white mold to give it a huge leg up and to make it kind of actually dominate on the cheese. But historically, brie wouldn't have been this perfectly white cheese that you see today. So that's why brie comes from that region. All the soft white cheeses of France come from that particular region in northern France. And that's why they developed, because they had a big market to sell soft cheese to nearby. And on top of that, the local climatic conditions meant that white mold tended to dominate much more than black, blues, and greens. The first cheese you're tasting here is Chaource, and it's actually a bit further south than this. You're getting down towards the Loire Valley, you're down towards between Paris and Dijon. But one thing about this area here is there was incredible transport links because of the wine trade. This is where your Sancerre comes from, and your Polony and your Polyfusé and things like that. And also they had the big city of Orléans nearby. Shows I've put on here because it is the way that it is made is a brie style. It has that white rind on it, but it's a tub cheese, so it's not designed to be thin, which means a thin cheese we designed to break it down fully to get a fully ripe cheese. This is quite a tall, thick cheese, number one. Number two, that means that by the time it had broken down fully, it would be overripe on the outside and ammoniate on the outside. So as a result, with this cheese, you get kind of a cross section. You should have a clean, fresh, acidic core, which just gives a bright zestiness, and a creaminess around the outside as that has broken it down, almost like you get three layers within the cheese. And that's historically what you'd expect. You'd serve this cheese when it's semi-broken down on the outside, but you still have this clean, acidic core. I put this cheese on the tasting because it's been around as long as brie. It's not as famous as brie, not as famous as Camembert, but historically it's as ancient as brie, but it managed to continue to be existed. The way that it's made is slightly different from brie. It's made to ferment more and it retains a bit more acidic, and it's made to be sold a lot younger. And it's really designed to showcase the richness of full fat milk. And so it's not a creaming rich cheese, but it definitely fits in that arena of being an enriched cheese, and you feel the kind of the lusciousness of it, of the velvetiness to it. And that's why we've matched it to a sparkling Chardonnay. All of the traditional matches for Camembert, or particularly for Brie, is champagne, you know, because they would traditionally have wines from the region with cheese from the region. And Brie can be quite rich. It can be quite hard to match to, but that light fizz from it just kind of cuts through the richness, you know. And Chardonnay is a traditional grape in Champagne. And particularly if the Chardonnay's been in oak a little bit, it gives it kind of a bready, toasty note, which kind of then a bit more body to it. You know, if you're talking about champagne, you're looking at the champagnes like Bollinger or Krug, which looking at you lot, I'm sure you lot drink a lot of Krug. You know, those ones have that toasty richness to them, and that just goes really well with Bries and Camemberts. And this particular cheese has an acidic core, but also the richness from the outside as it breaks down. And I think that'll go really well with the gentle fizz that you get from this sparkling Chardonnay. The cans, if you're interested, I know a lot of you have been on the tastings before, but the cans are all sourced from the real quality vineyards in South Africa. South Africa really struggled with COVID. They weren't allowed to sell alcohol at all. And so as a result, a lot of the wine producers really struggled. And what it meant is that the Banks brothers, who have Michelin-starred restaurants over towards York, Tommy Banks is a famous chef. You'll see him on Great British Menu quite a lot. Um, what happened with them is that allowed them to approach these wine producers who normally wouldn't can their wine because it's too good quality. But as they were Michelin-starred chefs, as they were really quality, as they already bought wine from a lot of these estates to use in their restaurants, they could persuade them to can them for them so that during COVID they could use them on their tasting boxes. And that allowed us to have a real quality wine in a canned format. Canning doesn't change the nature of the wine, so unlike in bottle where it matures, in the can format it stays really fresh and a bit more vibrant. So they have to be a little bit careful of when they can it because it won't further develop once it's been canned. But these are amazing little producers that we have from South Africa, and this is a great example of a champagne equivalent. You know, that light zestiness should cut through the richness of the Chaource. Any questions on the Chaource at all before we move on to the next cheese? Nope, you're all just hungry. Right, so we'll move on to the. I'll go for it, Elizabeth.
Yeah, sorry, just I don't know whether this is a question or a comment, but I think of brie as a very mild cheese, and and you normally start with the mildest in your tastings and go through to the strongest ones, and
Yeah.
that had really quite a punch. Actually, it's got quite a strong flavour.
Yes, yeah, and I think that apart from the fin, I probably should have put the fin next. We're going to go on to the fin now. I think brie, a modern brie generally tends to be quite mild. And the reason for that is that stabilized brie type that we've all become associated with is
Right,
really
yeah.
creamy and buttery and really easy to eat. And the white mold that grows on the outside is quite simple. But a traditional brie, and if you look at the rinds on all these bries, there's a lot of browning and a lot of wrinkliness on them. There's actually much more diversity on the rind, and a lot of those yeasts and molds and bacteria that grow in synergy on the rind give much more stronger flavors. And I think a traditional brie style would be a bit more punchy like these ones. And I think all the
Right.
cheeses tonight will be a bit more in that kind of punchy air arena, apart from the next one, which we maybe should have started with, but I wanted to start with France. Um, but you know, you're dead right. A lot of people associate brie with being quite mild, but for me, a traditional brie should be quite intense.
Right, good.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Right, fab. Right, we'll move on to the next cheese, which is the Fin. And we've put this on there because one of the major Brie and Camembert styles that became famous in France was what we call the cream enriched cheese, of which the most famous is a cheese nowadays, probably a cheese called Vignotte or Delice, if you've heard of Vignotte or Delice. But the original one was probably a cheese called Brie Savin. Brie Savin. So back to that region of Paris, around Paris, traditional white rinded cheeses. In the 1800s, Paris got very gastronomic. It was getting all very carried away. This was the era of champagne, foie gras, you know, snipe. This was the era of excess. Okay, it was all about food to excess. Roasting your chicken, packing it full of butter before you roasted it. That's the kind of the French way. And the French thought, how can we make a cheese more extravagant? So you're tasting the thin cheese. And what they decided to do was get milk and extra cream to it before they made the cheese. And that's how they decided they would try and make an even more extravagant cheese. How about making cheese that's cream enriched, cheese with extra cream in it? The problem is it doesn't really work. Too high a fat content in milk isn't good for cheese making. Fat spoils faster, you get soapy flavors, it breaks down too fast, and it holds moisture too much. And so it wouldn't make a keeping cheese, even it wouldn't even mature as long or as a brie and a camembert. So you couldn't have time for flavor development. So, but they decided to go ahead and do it because these cream-enriched cheeses became part of the Parisians' gastronomic fancy. But they realized they couldn't mature it for a long time. It wouldn't keep for a long time. So they basically just drained it and sold it fresh, with a little bit of a rind on it. A normal brie will be about 8, 9 weeks before you eat it. Like a camembert, maybe 6, 7. This is only 2 or 3. So what you get is that clean freshness, but because it's cream enriched, you get a real decadence to it. And this is designed, the French designed this style of cheese so that you would sit in Parisian cafes and you wouldn't have a cheese board, you just have this cheese with a glass of champagne. It was the sign of decadence, cream, extra cream within the cheese. But it didn't make a keeping cheese, as I said, so they had to kind of develop it to be a really young, fresh, really just showing it's just basically like eating butter, percentage without wanting to put you off, percentage fat within the cheese, you're looking at almost butter quantities. You're almost eating basically butter, and that it is designed to be that decadent. And this is called a cream enriched brie. You get them double creams or triple creams. As I said, historically they wouldn't do it because it's a waste of cream. The cream would go to make butter, and the full fat milk would go to make cheese. You wouldn't put the two together. It was just a waste of good cream. But they only did it in the era of extravagance. The one you're tasting here isn't French. Brie at Savran's probably the most French one. The one you're tasting here is one of the few British types that is made. And this is made by Charlie Westhead. Charlie, one of Britain's original start of the modern British Revolution. Very famous for a cheese called Ragstone and Doorstone. And he makes an incredible organic creme fraiche as well with cream. But he started making cheese for Neal's Yard Dairy, very famous, amazing cheesemongers in London. They employed him as a cheesemonger, but they found that he wasn't very good with people. But he was quite a hard worker. So they put him in the cellar and let him make yogurt. But he really enjoyed it, and he used to make yogurt down in the cellar that they sell in the shop. And so he then got into that and set up his own little business in Herefordshire, moved up to Herefordshire, and set up a business on Dorstone Hill near Hay-on-Wye, and decided to make creme fraiche, yogurt still, but also start to make different cheeses. And he was a real big fan of these cream enriched bries. And so he's really one of only about 2 or 3 producers in the UK making cream enriched brie. Because again, it's just an expensive way to make cheese because you've got to put a lot of extra cream in. And finding cream is really hard because milk processors don't want to give you it because they want to make butter out of it. So it's very rare to find a cream enriched cheese. But we put this on there because I feel like it's an important type of sort of white rinded brie styles is the cream enriched, of which Vignot and Delice and Brie Savin are the most famous. But they're the most recent of the brie styles. 1800s onwards really is when they started to become invented. Any questions on that at all before we move on to the big numbers, the big bries? No. And you should be moving, those of you doing it with the wines, you should be moving with the wines onto the next wine now. And then let me just pull up some pictures. Right, so now we're going to talk about brie. And there's 2 bries to taste. I'll cover them. You can taste them both together if you want. You can compare them. There's the Baron Bigod and the Brie de Meaux, and they'll both go with the Muscadet wine. But let me just pull up a picture of Paris and we can talk a little bit about Brie. So Brie is traditionally a region. It's coming out east of Paris, coming out all. Let me just get rid of that. All the way over to here. Nowadays, Brie isn't name protected. Okay. Historically it was, but you can see there you go, Condé en Brie. And each one of these villages made a brie. Some of them are still famous. So you may have heard of Coulommiers. Coulommiers is a very, very famous brie style that came from the village of Coulommiers. What we're tasting here is a Brie de Meaux, Meaux, Brie de Meaux. That's a classic and the original brie style. There's also Brie de Moulon. I'm sure there'll be a Moulon here. Moulon down there, Brie de Moulon. That was, they made bries down there. There's a Brie de Nangis. If you look at it, there's a famous Brie de Nangis. And basically, this was the region of Brie, and you had all these villages making Brie styles, and the name came from them. They all made slightly different Bries in this region, but then they would all be ferried into Paris. Now, Brie traditionally, around that left-hand side of Paris, to the east of Paris, it's flat, it's lots of land, and traditionally there was lots of monastic estates. Let me just put a message in so lots of big monasteries, and they made the big monasteries had lots of land, they had lots of cows. The lay brothers had lots of time. They
And
weren't a
Andy,
farmer who was
uh,
tied. Oh, go for it, Bob.
sorry to interrupt, mate, but which cheese should we try now? The Baron Bigod or the Brie de
Brie de
Meaux?
Meaux. Both of them, really. You can do them either order you want, but I'm going to talk. They're both basically the same recipe.
with
So
with,
I'm
with the
going to talk.
Muscadet.
But with the Muscadet, yeah. So I
Right,
taste the
thank you.
Baron Bigod and the Brie de Meaux. I'm going to cover them both together. I'll go into the specific producers in a minute, but in general, I'm going to talk about Brie as a general region. And these are both examples of Brie. So the key things about Brie is historically, traditionally, it came from that region to Paris, that Brie region, just the south and the east of Paris, that region coming up like that. It was traditionally made by monasteries, traditionally made by monks, big, large monastic estates. They had lots of cows. Therefore, they had lots of milk. And also, the monks had lots of times on their hand because all they had to do was pray. So they had time to dedicate themselves to cheese making. It's very different to some other regions like Camembert, we'll talk about in 2 minutes. So the lots of milk means that traditionally brie should be a large cheese. Sorry, I know you can't say that's a bit of a blend, but a large, big cheese traditionally. One of the main reasons is they had lots of milk, so they made bigger cheeses. Traditionally, brie is made with the full fat of the milk and made relatively fast and continually. And that's because the lay brothers had lots of time on their hands. They didn't have to run around and do other jobs. Like a farmer's wife has got lots of other stuff to do. A lay brother in a monastery doesn't have anything to do. I always think of historically, therefore, Brie is more like the gentleman of the two. So when you compare true Brie with true Camembert, I think they're both great, but I think Camembert's the farmer. We'll cover that in a minute. But Brie is the gentleman. It's kind of a smooth, creamy cheese, but it's a bit more refined, buttery. The flavor notes there are often kind of a little bit of porcini, little bit of mushroom, little bit of yeastiness, but creme fraiche, buttery richness to them. There is 12 producers left of classic and original Brie. So the name Brie isn't protected by the French government, but there are two styles of Brie that aren't protected by the French government. So Brie that is made in Meaux, so they call it Brie de Meaux, which is what you're tasting here, and that comes from this area, the little village of Meaux here, which still has a monastery in it, but they don't produce cheese anymore. And there's another Brie called Brie de Moulon, which is down here. Now, we're not tasting that today. We do usually taste it on this tasting, but unfortunately, there is no pasteurized version of that cheese being made. And at the moment, it's illegal to import raw milk cheese in from France, so we can't taste it. So, just various reasons for that we can go into later on if you want. They are slightly different. Brie de Meaux's a little bit, Moulon is a touch smaller, a bit more rustic and a bit intense. But if you can get your hands on Brie de Moulon when you're in France, I think it's a fabulous quality brie. But at the moment we're tasting the Brie de Meaux from up here. Brie de Meaux, traditionally, and they still do this at the Donge family, it's hand ladled. So they're making these little vats that you can see behind them, multiple little vats, even if they're a regional size producer. And then each cheese is ladled by hand, and that allows them to keep the curd um, softer and more gently. And then it's drained traditionally on reed mats and sold traditionally on these reed mats. You can see they make a reasonable amount of brie, but it goes and gets dried and then forms its white rind, which helps it break down. But the hand ladling, as you see here, for me is really key to the process. That allows for gentle drainage and allows for a smoothness of the cheese. But for me, it should have a thin rind that should be undulating. It's made with traditional cows from that region. It's made only with cows that are fed in that region and fed on traditional forage. And they have in order to legally make it in France, they have to ladle by hand. This one's made by the Donge family. You can see on the, maybe can't see it if I put it at an angle, I think it comes up. Um, Very famous. You'll see, if you maybe you can't see it, but it says at the top there, hand molded or hand ladled. They put it on the packaging. You quite often see that in French. It'll say moulage manuel or moule à la louche, which means hand ladled. It's insisted upon it. So in order to make traditional brie, hand ladled from that region, traditional breed of cows, and technically it needs to be made from raw milk as well. And there's only about 12 producers left, of which the Donge family here are one of the smallest. They still source milk from about 30 farms. Each one of those farms has no more than 50 cows. They collect the milk every single day, and they visit every farm every day on a separate occasion to inspect the hygiene in order to make raw milk cheese on a factory level. But for me, brie should be more runny, creamier, butterier, and more rounded, and a bigger cheese. You know, a little bit more refined, a little bit rich in flavour, but a little bit more delicate than perhaps a Camembert. Being a Moulon is a touch going towards a Camembert, but it's not as extreme as a Camembert itself. There we go. So you're tasting here a classic and original, which is the Donge family. If you were buying good quality brie in the UK 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, most of it is made by Donge. The other family I really like is Rouxer. We sometimes see Rouxer brie, and that's a real quality brie as well. And they still make on a family operation as well. They're the only two families making it rather than the larger industrial producers. So that's the two kind of French styles, classic bries. About 10 years ago now, I had a farmer come to me from Suffolk, a guy called Johnny Crickmore, and he was not making any money from selling liquid milk, right? And I'll show you a picture of him in a minute. Let me just open this picture because it's quite interesting. And 10 years ago, he came to me and said, "What am I going to do on my farm?" It was proper, "I'm not making any money from my milk." And we said, "Well, make cheese. It's a good way to diversify your farm, and a good way to kind of have a go at it." And so he went round and he visited us and talked to Neil's Yard Dairy. And after looking at them all, he decided that there was no good British brie being made in the UK. A lot of the brie being made with that stabilized brie type, you know, really springy. The problem with making a traditional brie is that it's like a pear. It's underripe for a long period. It's chalky and dry. It breaks down from the surface in. That white mold does the legwork to break down the cheese. So a traditional brie should have a thin rind. It should be a browning on the rind. It should take a long time for the flavors to develop. And then when it's ripe, it has a short selling window. It's not appropriate for mass food distribution. But Johnny decided if he went to all the top restaurants in London, they still stocked French brie. It might not be appropriate for mass food distribution, but by Jove, it's tasty and even more tasty than the industrial bries. So he decided if he could make a brie in the real true style of an original brie de Meaux, he would transform his farm. So he employed a French dairy professional to come over and help him. And this Frenchman turned up, wandered around, smoked a Gaulois apparently, and went, "If you want to make a brie as good as the French, you have to have a French breed of cow. That's where the quality of the milk starts." And then basically went. But Johnny took his advice and changed his breed of cow to be the Montbéliard cow. Rather than having the black and white cow, which is actually a Dutch-German breed that came across in the Second World War, he took his advice and changed all his cows, went abroad to France and imported 70 Montbéliard cows and got rid of his black and whites. And he did that in order to improve the protein and the fat content within his milk so that he could make a traditional brie. This is what Johnny was like when he came to us 10 years ago, 10 years ago and wanting to make cheese. This is the first batch of cheese he made. We went down and saw him, and we were one of the first three customers ever to stock it. You know, I'll show you the success of making cheese because this is what Johnny's like now. He's a fairly changed man. He's a businessman now. He was a farmer, wondering how he could make cheese and keep his farm going. But it shows you the success. He doesn't have a bigger farm anymore. He doesn't have a bigger farm. He doesn't have more staff. He was making a loss at this stage from selling milk. Now he has 40 members of staff. He turns all his milk into cheese, and as all a result of adding value to his farm and making cheese. So it just shows you, I mean, that if you add value to your milk, you can really keep a farm economically going and make something special. But the key thing for Johnny is he tried to mimic exactly what the French were doing. So like this, still doing what they were doing, ladling by hand, making traditionally. Cows out of pasture, traditional Montbéliard cows, that thin, undulating rind. And he was trying to create something really French in style. And that's what I feel he's done, really. I think the Baron Bigod is a great example of a brie, a classic and original brie, kind of made very, very French in style. Any questions on that one at all? Will I briefly talk about the Go for it,
Yeah,
Elizabeth.
on the leaflet that we've got, it
Yes.
says in one place it says that the Baron Bigod is pasteurized, and in another
I know.
place it says it's
Yeah,
on.
that's a good spot. So I missed one of them when I was changing it. So when Johnny started for the first 6 or 7 years, it was a raw milk cheese. It was made with unpasteurized milk. Now, about 4 years ago, he decided to pasteurize. Um, Lots of different reasons for that, but one of the main reasons was that it's really difficult in Britain at the moment to make a raw milk soft cheese. It's hard enough to make a raw milk hard cheese. Hard cheese has more safety points in it, a longer fermentation, a drier in texture, and a higher salt per moisture, which means that it's much more safer to make a hard cheese. But Johnny was making safe raw milk cheese, but he felt like uh, the government policy when he was employing 30 members at that stage, 30 members of the team, it was just a bit challenging for him to continue and risk all those jobs with the way that the government policy was going. So that's why he switched to pasteurizing. The molds and yeasts and the bacteria that grow on this cheese are imported direct from France. There's a laboratory in Cannes in France where they develop the stuff that's used in Brie de Meaux, and there's a whole different range of stuff. And he imports from there and uses exactly the same as what the Brie de Meaux producers would be using. Um, Bob and Les, do you have a question? Bob. Bob. So. The wine I've matched as well is Muscadet. I like Muscadet because it's from the Loire area, but what they do is they keep it on their lees, which means they mature it on top of the yeast. A lot of time when the yeast is fermented and dies, they get rid of it. But within Muscadet, you might say Surly's on there, they actually mature it as they age the wine with the yeast cells still there from the fermentation, which I think gives a bit more body and a bit more richness, which means it can stand up to one of the difficult things with Bries and Camemberts is matching wine to them. They actually have a lower fat content than something like Parmesan, but because of their softness, they feel fattier, they feel richer, and then they coat the mouth a lot faster than something like Parmesan or Cheddar, which is higher in fat, but it's all trapped in a different way. And so I think that fat coating of the mouth is really difficult to match wine to. And so you have to be really clever with it. And I think something with a bit more body and a bit more richness, like the Muscadet, hopefully stands a bit more to this cheese. Some of you have got a perfectly right piece of Baron. Some of you have a little bit chalk in the middle, just as we were switching batches. Now, actually, that's because we were switching batches, if you're interested. So what we are just selling, what we started selling towards the middle of this week, but we weren't at the beginning of this week, was cheeses when they first went out to pasture. So the cheese is about 8, 10 weeks old. Johnny goes out to pasture early May. When his cows first go out into grass, what happens is the fat content in his milk really drops. The reason being is that early spring grass is really tough. It's not got much sugar in it. It's quite dry. It's grown throughout the winter. The cows have generally been indoors up to that stage. So they're producing quite rich in fat milk because they've been given rich feed that's been semi-fermented that was made last summer. When the cows first go out to pass, the fat content in their milk drops. As a result, we call fat the guardian of moisture. And as a result, they make drier cheeses. And we always sometimes we've been a bit caught out by this year, but these cheeses that were made 8 weeks ago were the first of them. Usually we try and anticipate it, and we will try and build our stock holding a little bit of brie because we know these drier cheeses take longer to mature and longer to break down. They do break down, but we're generally selling them at 10, 11 weeks rather than 8, 9 weeks at fully ripe. And that's just a good cheesemonger is actually knowing that and tweaking what you're doing. We have now built that stock, and we have slowed down our brie sales. We've taken it out the shop, so we're not selling it at the same rate. We don't just sell what people ask for, we sell what's ripe, and that's again a good cheesemonger. But this is a cheese that is made by a single farm, so will vary with the milk and the seasons. The milk isn't standardized like it is in a factory, so it's not a consistent standardized pasture like homogenized milk. And as a result, it's going to vary. And what you're seeing this particular moment in time is early spring cheeses, which are drier in texture and mature a lot slower because of the lower fat content in the milk, which is just spring grass, early spring grass. That'll change as the season comes on. The August cheeses are a nightmare. They're even worse because there's a lot more yeast in the air because of all the grass that's being cut. He calves a lot of cows, so there's a lot of fat in the milk from those the late lactation cows and the new calving cows, and as a result, we have cheeses that are incredibly the other side of the spectrum. So if we do this tasting in late September, you tend to find the cheeses are really brown on the rind, really collapsing, really going everywhere. Single farm cheese is not the same product every week. And as a cheesemonger, we try and react to that. And the August cheeses, we will pull back and keep them colder and sell them faster and sooner. But this particular batch just caught us on the hop a little bit, if I'm perfectly honest. But it just shows you how a good cheesemonger, if you're making a stabilized brie, we wouldn't have those problems. We'd buy it, we'd treat it like a bottle of wine. We'd buy it, put it in the shop, it's ready to sell. But dealing with a traditional brie is actually we're dealing with a much more living, evolving product that will vary. And as a result, we have to be a little bit more on it in terms of what we're doing.
So the one that we had was ever so slightly sort of firmer and chalky in the middle, but only with like a very faint but it had a really sort of delayed bitterness to it that was absolutely awesome. It just different to the Brie de Meaux, which was super soft and super creamy and just sort of dissolved in your mouth. The British one had this just really sort of sharp bitterness right at the very end. It was lovely.
Yeah, I think sometimes you get those brassicary notes which come through, which I think really sometimes can actually help the cheese. And I actually find when the Baron Bigot's, that Brie de Meaux from Donge is like, you set your watch by it. It's always good. It always has that luscious texture. But the Baron Bigot, when it's good, just has a little bit more going on, I think, a little bit more depth to it. But Brie de Meaux Donge are sourcing milk from 30 farms. They then standardize the milk so they make much more consistent cheese. Even though they make a real great example of a traditional cheese, whereas Johnny is really what his cows feed on is what you're getting in that milk, and that's what you're getting in that cheese. So it's a much more reflection of that place. It's a single farm.
Okay. So the French one kind of merges all the milk of all the cows of all the farms together.
So you get a level of consistency.
Yeah, got you. Okay, right.
Whereas the Baron Bigot will never quite ever be the same cheese week to week. It'll have a level of consistency because they're good farmers and they're good cheesemakers. But it's never going to be bang, dead on the metal. Whereas the Brie de Meaux is just perfect. Right. Well, we'll move on to the next cheese, and that's Camembert. Now, Camembert came later than Brie. Brie has been around since the medieval ages and Middle Ages. Then around and Camembert, if you think about it, doesn't fit with my story in that it's not Normandie's not that close to Paris. By the time the cheeses would have made it to Paris, they would have gone off. So why do they make soft white-rinded cheeses in Camembert? Well, they make it, a lot of things come down from history, and they make it because in around about the 1700s, the Reformation, around that time, the abbots and monks, they weren't that keen on them around Brie. They were doing a lot of guillotining of those type of people. And so some of them fled. They fled, and one of them fled to Normandy. Well, several of them fled to Normandy. and they brought with them their brie making techniques. So they fled across to Normandy and they brought with them their brie making techniques. And as a result, they taught the farmers' wives in Normandy how to make brie much later than a camembert, much later than brie. So as a result, camembert is a more recent developed really 1700s onwards. No, they taught farmers' wives throughout Normandy, and there would have been lots of different cheeses. It wasn't just Camembert. There was Nivernais, there was Inchville, there was Havre. Every single village made like a soft little white rinded cheese. But Camembert became famous, and all the other ones kind of become absorbed by the name of Camembert, and they now just make Camembert in Normandy. But Camembert developed differently to Brie. They set off from this same point, but they have different pressures on their farms. This is not some monk with big estates and lots of milk having lots of time to make cheese. This is some farmer's wife with a small herd of cows, probably only 5, 6, 8 cows. And this farmer's wife in Normandy has lots of other stuff to do. You know, she's not just making cheese because she's a monk and praying. She's doing everything on the farm, basically. She's making breakfast, dinner, tea. She's cleaning the house. She's looking after the calves. She's looking after the chicken. She's making the bread. So her cheese making has to fit into all of that. So even though the monks gave them this brie recipe, they tweak it and it evolves over 200-300 years to be a very different thing because the farmer's wife is in a different situation to the monks. Number one, the cheese ends up being smaller. They don't have as much milk. They don't make these big cheeses. So traditional Camembert brie is big. Traditional Camembert is small. Number one. Number two, the cheese is made over a longer time. And what that allows is it allows for more flavor development in the cheese. And that's why I always compare Camembert to being the farmer of the two. So rather than the brie is kind of a bit more gentlemanly, a little bit more smooth, a little bit more creamy, a little more buttery, a little bit more restrained. Whereas Camembert is a little bit like farmer, it's a bit more rustic, it's a bit more intense, it's a little bit more in your face, you know? So as a result, I think the classic flavors from Camembert are much more vegetal, you know, garlicky, brassicary, cabbagey, intense flavors. I always see it as the big, bold brie style in your face. And so I always think of Camembert as a bit more in your face. The other problem with Camembert is by the time the farmer's wife got around to making the cheese, the cream had settled off, right? And so, unlike with brie, where the monk could crack on, got all the cream in it, made a full fat cheese, Camembert, the cream had settled off. So she couldn't make it into cheese, so she just skimmed that cream off and made the cheese anyhow. With that cream, she made butter. And some of you may have heard of Normandy butter. It's regarded as one of the finest butters. The reason being is Normandy butter historically was a byproduct of making Camembert. So the cream was already soured. So as a result, it made this really intense cultured butter. And that was a byproduct of making the Camembert itself. The Camembert itself that's left is made from the leftover milk that is actually semi-skimmed because the cream's gone. You know, it's settled out because she took so long to make the cheese. As a result, when a Camembert is ripe, it doesn't go running. A ripe brie will run away. It will run off the plate. And because it has a high fat content, because it's got all the fat of the milk in it, it's got all the cream in it. The Camembert doesn't have all the fat and the milk in it because she's lost some. She's made it into butter because she's been too slow on a cheese make. As a result, the Camembert is made with a semi-skim of the milk, which means it doesn't ripen in the same way. So a fully ripe Camembert shouldn't run away. It should be elastic and almost like bread dough. You know, I always think, you know, kind of has a bulge to it. It's ripe, but it's not runny. And those are just historic differences that has evolved over 200 years because of the way Camembert has evolved as a farmer's wife cheese and Brie has evolved as a monastic cheese, you know, and that's why you get it. Now, as I said, in Normandy, they made a whole range of different soft cheeses, but Camembert became famous. Why did Camembert become famous as their original soft cheese? Well, there's two main reasons for it. The main, number one, is that in the 1800s, there was an engineer in the town of Camembert, and he developed something which would transform the distribution of soft cheese. And that was the wooden box, right? The wooden box was developed in the town of Camembert. And what it meant is the town of Camembert, it might seem like some really simple thing, But prior to that, they used to just put it in trays, put straw on the top and the bottom. By the time we got to market, a lot of those cheeses were leaking and collapsing all over their trays. Or if a really dry day, they'd dry out and crack and shrink. The wooden box that was invented in Camembert, a little poplar box, acts like a humidor. When it's too dry, it keeps it soft and humid. When it's too hot, it holds it all together. When it's too moist, it can still breathe and let go of moisture, but gently. So the might seem like a simple piece of packaging, but that little wooden box allowed for Camembert to be transported outside of the region, and people became known, and it allowed for Camembert to be sold out of the region. So it just shows you how packaging can make a huge difference, and that's why Camembert became famous. And we're not sitting here eating Nivernet because the engineer grew up in Camembert. It really is that simple little detail. Because Camembert could transport, they kind of exacerbated that fame. And exacerbate that fame because of a key development during the First World War. So during the First World War, the French government used to give you extra rations if you were in the trenches, right? And if you were in the trenches, so basically, I'm not here to talk about wartime history, but you would end up doing some of your time when you're at the front line in the trenches, when you might go over the top, you do some on the reserve line, you get some rest, you'd rotate round. But everybody knew the hardest part was in the trenches. So as a result, you get extra rations in the trenches. And the French government had a cheese nearby that could make it to the trenches really easily because it was in nice wooden boxes. And so you would get a quarter of Camembert a day extra if you're in the trenches. And it was kind of your ration uplift because you were doing the trench work. Now, obviously, being in the trenches was absolutely horrible. But what it did have is it had a lot of comradeship. It had a lot of soldiers that, were together and grouped together and fighting together that knew each other and had been through all that horrible atrocities together. And so as a result, once they kind of left the trenches after the Second World War, people from places who'd never heard of Camembert, people from Marseille and Nice, from the south of France and Lyon, who'd never heard of Camembert, had been forced to eat it in the trenches. But then as a result, when they went back to their hometowns, they knew about Camembert, so they carried on eating it. And a lot of them had grown to like it and had associated it with that time and that comradeship and all their friends being in the trenches. So Camembert, kind of the fame of it spread even further and even wider as a result of it being just this little cheese that the French kept within their trenches. And you can see that. I'll show you some of the Camembert labels from that time. And I'll be really quick because you're not here to look at packaging. There's one of them, Camembert label from that time. There's another Camembert label from that time, and there's another Camembert label from that time. It was really key to them. Camembert became the backbone of that ration uplift, which kind of, as a result, made the cheese famous. And nowadays in Normandy, they don't make all the other little village cheeses because if you're a cheese maker in Normandy, you might as well make Camembert. You can make Camembert there, and you can sell it a lot easier than trying to sell a little cheese called Inchville, which nobody's ever heard of. So traditional Camembert, like this one you've got there, should be ladled by hand. Technically, it should be made with raw milk. It should be made with the Normand breed of cows, this ancient breed of cows from the Normandy region, which gives, again, a good rich milk, similar to the Montbéliard we saw for brie production earlier on. And it should be overnight matured slowly, and it forms, again, that kind of yeast and thing-like rind. Camembert itself isn't name protected, but if you get Camembert de Normandie, it has to fit all those gaps. More so, it's always confusing, but Camembert Fabrique in Normandy, that means it's made in Normandy, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's hand ladled, it's raw milk, and it's made from Norman breed of cows from grass in Normandy. But Camembert de Normandie ticks all of those boxes and is your classic and original example of what you'd expect. And that's what you're tasting here. So that's number 5. And number 6 is the Tunworth, which is kind of a British nod towards Camembert. So about similar to Johnny Crickmore's story here, but about 2002, Stacey Hedges down in Hampshire, which has very similar geography and geology to Normandy. The plateau goes underneath the English Channel and across to Hampshire. Decided she wanted to make a Camembert as good as the French. So she went aboard to France, and her and Charlotte, her business partner, tried to mimic the whole process, ladling by hand, um, kind of making by hand, maturing slowly, allowing for that yeast development on the rind, and trying to make really a British example of a Camembert. Again, something which isn't just mild and bland, but has that vegetal, brassicary, porcini note that a true French Camembert should have. I think when it comes to soft cheeses, Britain makes a lot of nice soft cheeses, but for something that is true in style to like a classic French style, the Baron Bigod for a Brie and the Tunworth for a Camembert are the ones that for me stand head and shoulders above the other British styles. And if you're talking about true definitions, I think they both fit that true definition. I also think Camembert, if I'm perfectly honest, Brie kind of think suffers more from industrialization than Camembert. I think if you buy a Camembert in a supermarket, they're always generally quite good, but Brie is generally quite bland and dry and average. I think it's a cheese that the recipe can can suffer the changes that are made to industrialization a little bit more. Any questions on those two before we finish up? I know you've got the tawny port, by the way, with it. What you've got there is a Cape Tawny, which is kind of a take on a tawny port, made with the same grapes, made to the same methods, but made in South Africa again. The reason I've put that with it is most wine experts, when you ask them about matching port and cheese, will tell you it's not a great match. Will tell you that often you lose a good port and you lose a good cheese. One overpowers the other and you don't taste them both at their best. The exception, if you look a lot of wine experts, the people like Jancis Robinson and all that will say, is Brie and Tawny Port. Kind of the fruity, kind of vanilla-y undertones. They would say if you're going to match port to a cheese and you want to do it properly, they would say port and Brie is better than port and blue cheese. I'm not sure I agree, but I thought it'd be nice to put it on the tasting because that is what the wine experts say. They say the best thing to match port to is Brie. And that's why we've matched it at the end here. And we've put a port on. We don't often use sweet wines in our tastings because often they're quite cloying and overpowering. But I thought it would be nice to kind of nod towards it at the end of what actually people think, the wine experts think will go with it, with a Brie style. Fine. Any questions before we just sum up? For me, nothing better than a good rustic cider or a glass of Calvados with a Camembert. It does work really well. Right, no, you're just ready to finish off. And to finish, I've oh, sorry, go for it, Scott and Paula.
Just about to say, so I was born and bred in Somerset, and a proper glass of scrumpy would be excellent with that, I think.
I think it just really works with Camembert. Actually, traditional scrumpy, traditional like cider apple ciders that have a bit of body and tannin to them. They really do work well with Camemberts and Bries. I'm a big fan of. We do a cider and cheese tasting usually once a year, and it's one of my favorite tastings. If you get good cider, it goes really well with cheese. Right. So, are you all ready for the final cheese? Now, I don't think a lot of you will necessarily think the final cheese is maybe the best cheese on the board, but we'll taste it anyways. So, in Paris, there is this thing when they take a Brie de Meaux, like you've tasted right early on, and they mature it for a year. They don't just leave it in their fridge for a year. In order to mature it for the year, they have to remove a lot of moisture for it, take a lot of moisture out of the cheese, so really dry it out. Not at the end of the process, but at day 2, when they're drying the cheese, they dry out the cheese and they mature it in conditions similar to a hard cheese. And they make this cheese called Brie Noir, black Brie, right? And this is Brie, which is a year old, okay? It becomes its own little different beast. It's very hard to get hold of, but I always remember I worked with a Frenchman many years ago, and he was selling it on in the Loire Valley, and he said he used to call it your grandma's cheese, and he used to say, when all her teeth are falling out and she hasn't got any taste buds, she'll love it. She'll buy some black Brie, because this is Brie. This is the same as the Brie de Meaux you tried earlier on, but it's been dried out a lot firmer on day 1 and then matured for a year. This is Brie a year old, so it hasn't broke down and gone really runny and oozy, but you will get more of those kind of ammonia, peppery, piquant notes that you'd expect to get from an old cheese, and it's a lot firmer in texture. It won't break down and become soft and runny because we've dried it out so that we can mature it. It's not designed to be a super soft cheese. It's designed to be a firm kind of a little bit reflection of kind of the way that brie can be. Very rare to see. Yeah, I mean, you see it in England once a year. Or you might see it on Borough Market every so often, but really it's a tough sell. I'm not going to lie to you. But you see it in Paris occasionally as a little bit of a novelty cheese more than anything. But it's called black brie, and it's brie matured for over a year. For me, bries and camembert's slightly younger, 5, 6, 7 weeks. Brie's 8, 9, 10 weeks old. And you quite often see on a brie the production date of it on. If you buy a brie and it never softens, or a camembert and it never softens, that is generally not a problem with maturation. Isn't that you've kept it too cold, isn't that you haven't kept it to its best before date, or you need to take brie till it's 2 weeks old, 2 weeks over its best before date. You hear all those stories. But actually, generally, if a brie never develops softness, you can feel it should go chalky and break down. It's probably because of the way it's been made on day one. They've either over fermented it or removed too much moisture on day one of cheese making. And as a result, it doesn't have the moisture in to break down. It doesn't matter how long you keep that cheese. It doesn't matter how warm you keep that cheese. It'll never break down. So if you've got a firm brie that's never breaking down, it's probably a problem with manufacturer rather than maturation. Yeah. There we go. Any questions on that, or I'll just sum up?
Cheers, Andy.
No, just want to say thank you very much, Andy. That was some stunning cheese, and I particularly like the port. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad you've enjoyed it. Well, I'll just say thank you very much for coming along. I know it's quite a detailed tasting. We do one on, I think we do one on Gower every now and then. We do one just when we taste 6 cheddars on the trot. We do a specific cheddar tasting, which is a really interesting one to look at the differences on farms that are 20, 30 miles apart. But, I think that what I've tried to illustrate is the individual characteristics of not only farmhouse cheese and how that will vary throughout the years, but of the true differences between brie and camembert. One thing I'd look out for if you're in France is Brie de Moulin, Coulommiers. I think they're great examples of brie that aren't the classics, and they're hard to find in the UK, but I think they're really, really good cheeses. Coulommiers and Brie de Moulin. Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you had any more questions, you're more than welcome to email them in or pick them up on another tasting. But thanks ever so much for coming along. I'll see you all soon.